And good afternoon. This is Chuck Black with Freedom Forum News, and I am online right now on a Zoom call with Paula Tucci, who has a substantial amount of expertise on some of the legal aspects of the current provincial lockdown. Good afternoon, Paula.
Hi, Chuck. How are you today?
Oh, not bad, not bad at all. It's a gorgeous, wonderful day. It's nice to be alive. It's nice to go outside.
Yes.
Uh, Tell us a little bit about what you've been doing for the last 6 months, the last 8 months, the last 9 months.
Well, Stand Up Canada is an official registered not-for-profit organization in Canada, and we came together because of COVID. Actually, a group of strangers in Ottawa, where I'm from, the Ottawa area, came together through a Facebook group that was called Stand Up Ottawa, and we were protesting every Saturday in front of Parliament Hill. Some days there would be 12 people there, and some days there were like 60. And we just realized, maybe because Ottawa is a bit of a bubble, I'm not sure, but we weren't having a lot of impact. So we formed a website called Stand Up Canada, and then became an official not-for-profit organization in October. And we realized, what is it that we're trying to do? Like, we have all these messages we're trying to say, and the our mandate is really to empower Canadians to know, first of all, that they have rights, and that the COVID measures are violating their rights and how they're violating their rights. In Canada, like, I was shocked to see personally how many people don't even know what their rights are. Like, they've heard of the charter, they don't know what the charter is. They've heard of human rights. Yeah, what does that really mean? And so it's no surprise, really. We've never had to know our rights ever before in history like this, because our rights have never been violated before from our own systems, really.
Hmm, hmm.
And so, while it's very clear to us, our message to Canadians is to make it very easy to understand how their rights are being violated, and what they can do about it, essentially.
Now, to that end, you put together a fairly substantial document several months back. I think you summarize our Canadian rights, and you summarize a little bit about how those rights are being curtailed during COVID. Can you tell me a little bit about the document?
Well, so there's actually, well, four major things that we've done, but I'll describe what we did in the order in which we did them. The first one was the document, was talking about charter rights for individuals, and we just kept it to, the charter, what people understood, and we explained in layman's terms, how what masks, how they violate your charter rights. And then we, took the time, we elaborated all the other provincial legislation that it violates, like essentially privacy rights, your human rights, that you have the ability to consent or not consent for medical treatment. So it was a long document, but it was needed. And, I wrote it in a way that was hopefully in layman's terms that people could understand and would compel them to keep reading it. So then we did another document for businesses to let them know that, if you were a non corporated business, so not a big corporation, that your Section 7 charter rights were also violated. Like, you've got charter rights as well if you're not incorporated. And so, that was just to get their attention, but also really was to say you're also violating your employee and your patron charter rights, as well as their human rights, by enforcing these orders. And then the third thing that we did, which I really should have started with at the beginning, but I didn't, it's just because I just felt it was a huge undertaking, and it was. It's a document that's called Canada-wide Declarations of Emergency. So essentially, it's a document that talks about how all of the emergency orders, like the declarations that each province declared, their declaration of emergency, how they were all done fraudulently. And when I say fraudulently, it means that in any legislation, like, if you look at it, and I'll explain in detail, but you've got to meet certain criteria. You just can't call or make a declaration of emergency unless you meet the specific criteria for it. So I started with Ontario because I knew Ontario hadn't. I knew that for a long time. And I wrote this document that I'm talking about. I wrote it in September. And I did it out of curiosity to see, well, let me see if I know for sure that Ontario didn't meet the specific criteria. I wonder, I bet you any money that Alberta, no, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, all of the provinces didn't, and they did not. When I did my own investigative work, my own analysis, it's very simple to see. It looks like a conspiracy, and I have to be very careful. I don't want to have anyone to think I'm a conspiracy theorist. There's no theory going on when you're analyzing things. You're analyzing stuff. So it's an analysis. That's all that this is. And so for this document, it was huge actually. And I finished it, I remember, on Friday, September the 4th. I uploaded it on our website. And then I went on a Zoom call with Vaccine Choice Canada on the Saturday. And on the Monday, which was Labor Day, that one document had 30,000 hits on that one day. And I thought, wow, we've got something. Because I knew when I wrote it, like I was very emotional when I wrote it, because there were provinces there that had 0 deaths and they were considered lockdown. Now, this was in September, okay? And so I just knew that we had something. And so since then, other provinces now have started to challenge their emergency orders, rightfully so, because I thought, what do we do with this document? Surely I can't be the only one that has done this analysis and has come to this conclusion. It's very simple to do if people were just to take the time to do it and look.
That makes perfect sense. You argue that the lockdown, particularly in Ontario, is unauthorized because it did not meet the specified criteria needed to make such a declaration. Can you go into that a little bit more?
Yeah. So I don't know if you want me to share my screen, if that's helpful to do.
Actually, it probably is helpful. Let me see if I can do that right now.
It's okay then from your end?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So really the title is saying here, this is for people to draw their own conclusion. Were criteria met for declaring these emergencies? They're all Canadian provinces and territories. So I talk about the background for business owners, for Canadian. I'm going to move this over here. Like in Ontario, we've declared a second emergency that I think now the Premier has declared terminated. But when I wrote this January 12th, there was a second emergency. And for all of those that are listening, the reason that a second emergency was done in Ontario was for the fact that, and it's at the bottom, that new measures would take effect. That's why he did it, the Premier did it.
Yes.
So I start by saying, in any province, in order to make a declaration of emergency in any province, certain conditions must be met, and it makes sense. Like I'm trying to get people to understand, it would make sense. Otherwise, you would have mass pandemonium for nothing. Conditions are identical to a safety feature on a firearm. They're 100% necessary, or you would kill someone by accident. So you need a safety measure. So you can't just say panic button, there's an emergency. You've got to meet certain criteria first before you hit that panic button. So I looked at Ontario in detail, and I talk about and it's a little farther down. In the beginning of this document, I talk about how Canada was locked down in 14 days. And these are the dates here where all the provinces made their initial declaration of emergency. It's one right after another. Ontario did ours here, where we are talking from, March the 17th. That was the first one. At that time, there was only one COVID-related death in Ontario and 2 in Canada, actually. And the first one was actually in BC. And so if I just sort of scoot on down, I break it down by saying to everybody on the document, here's this analysis here for Ontario. And it's not that difficult to do. And you look at it, how do you do an analysis? You look at what the legislation says and you challenge it, because that's why I was curious. I'm like, let me read what it says. Let me look at the rules. Everybody needs to stop and hit the pause button and look at the rules before they all jump on the bandwagon to decide themselves. So on March the 17th, right, the Premier Ford made this declaration of emergency, and he did it under his authority, which is section 7.0.1 of the Emergency Management Civil Protection Act. That's the act for Ontario. Every province has their own emergency act. So in this case, in order to make this declaration of emergency, though, the following 2 criteria needed to have been met under this subsection. So I won't go into all the detail but even though it's easy to read, so when you talk about when he makes this declaration, it says you have to follow, it's like you're following the steps under 7.0.13, an order declaring that an emergency exists throughout Ontario or any part of it may be made under this section if, in the opinion, the Lieutenant Governor and Council or the Premier, as the case may be, that like the following criteria are satisfied. So, and that's highlighted in red, and you can't, on our website, we don't have that ability. It's just a black bold. Red is much better. So I'm happy that this came up. So here's the criteria. It has to say that there is an emergency that requires immediate action to prevent or mitigate a danger of major proportions. So there's keywords and everything. The keyword here is immediate, which means present time. And then of course, danger of major proportions. That could result in serious harm to persons or substantial damage to property. And I say, okay, let's see. Let me challenge now the word immediate and then danger of major proportions. So on March the 17th, there was one COVID-related death in Ontario. So immediate has the meaning, it constitutes the present time. It's not a future anticipated event. One death at that present date and time back in March did not constitute an immediate action that needed to have been taken by the government. Whoops. One death, therefore, does not constitute any danger of major proportions in consideration of Ontario's population of like 14.7 million people. Okay. So therefore, the criteria under, and you just piece it one at a time, the criteria under 7.0.1.31, which is the first one, is that there's an emergency that requires immediate action to prevent. So it doesn't exist. It was therefore not met, making the Premier's declaration unjustified. So you go down, you say, okay, well now, what happened now? So I break this between then, the original declaration, and of course, Ontario was the first province, I think, to declare a second one. It's been very hard to follow what all the provinces are doing because there's just multiple things going on.
Yes.
So the same thing. So if we look back to January 12th, when the Premier declared a second state of emergency under the legislation, the provincial legislation, there were only, and I say only, every death is tragic. And so don't get me wrong, a death is a death and it's sad for anybody that loses their family. But if we're talking data, and which is what we are, there were 5,127 COVID-related deaths in Ontario when the Premier made this second provincial emergency. And again, you have to go back to the same terminology, the same requirement, immediate, constitute a present time. Again, it's not a future anticipated event. 5,127 deaths at that time did not constitute any immediate action that needed to be taken. And now here's the kicker, especially when the majority of those deaths occurred in long-term care homes. And again, out of our population of nearly 15 million people, and including when the recovery rate is 99.9%. So it didn't meet it then, it doesn't meet it now. We have a legal precedent. So countries around the world are challenging this, and there was an article that we put in the newspaper about that. One of them that I'm listing here is a legal precedent that has already been established in Ecuador on January 2nd, 2021, because it takes time for anything legal to be challenged and to get a ruling. So the court found there that, and I'll just read it here, that the president based the state of emergency on a possible future risk and not a current one, without sufficient, clear, and specific information. Since the states of exception of operation in the face of a current and certain circumstance, the actual occurrence, wow, my screen is, sorry about that, Chuck. The actual occurrence of events is not justified. Therefore, the court declared that decree to be unconstitutional. So somebody else looked at it and they said, wait a second, this is exactly why we have to look at the wording here. The wording says it constitutes an immediate action, not a future anticipated action. And farther down, the document talks about the fact that in the beginning, they used a predictive model from the UK. Professor Neil Ferguson, if we've all heard of him, who predicted all these, like Canada would have 326,000 deaths, which represented 0.8% of the population. And so in reality, 0.024% of the population at that time had died. I mean, that's a huge difference. So they Yeah.
So so you're saying that these declarations, particularly the ones in March and April of last year, were based not on immediate dangers, but on potential future projections by scientists that never occurred.
By not even Canadian scientists, exactly. By
Okay.
this professor, Neil Ferguson from the UK, because
Okay.
everybody was relying on him. And so we took direction from the World Health Organization. And again, there's a constitutional question that's been launched by constitutional lawyer Michael Swinwood just recently. His law firm is called Elders Without Borders, and we'll be putting more information about that. But he asks that question in this notice of constitutional question. He's saying essentially that since when does Canada take direction from a foreign entity for our things that are happening in Canada, like our legislation, what we're doing here? It's not supposed to happen. So yes, so they were all based on a future prediction, a prediction of what might happen. God forbid it might happen. And
But it
so,
never occurred. It never occurred.
we would always say, you would always give the government benefit of the doubt. You would always need to believe that your government is acting in good faith. And so, you know, I'll just tell you, I could go on and on.
I
I'm
I
going to,
understand that. I understand that what you're saying seems logical and sensible and rational. But what
yeah,
we're looking at right now is legal phrasing, legal terms, laws. And I understand you're not a lawyer. Are there legal experts who share your viewpoint relating to this?
100%. Yes, yes, yes. So I just made my notes, so I'm making sure that I'm staying on track. Yeah, the first person, constitutional lawyer, he's I think one of the top ones in Canada, Rocco Galati. Rocco, on behalf of 9 plaintiffs, submitted a lawsuit against COVID measures, and that was on July 6th. And part of it included exactly this, my own analysis here,
Mhm.
that the criteria, they call it a regulatory criteria, wasn't met. Therefore, it means that it's not a force in
Mhm.
legal terms. It's ultra vires. It's not a force. So yes, so Ontario has done it. Alberta has launched their legal challenge to their emergency order because
Mhm.
it's the same situation with Ontario. BC has also hired Rocco Galati to represent them to challenge their emergency order. New Brunswick has started a petition actually to get people to take action because in this document, Chuck, so this is all about the analysis.
Mhm.
It's all about we talk about it, the resources, like you use their wording and you say, well, wait a second, and you look at the actual reality of it, it doesn't meet it. So I'm not the only one that thinks it. Thank goodness other lawyers do. Rocco
Mhm.
does. In other countries, so not only we have the legal precedents in Ecuador, but in Ohio, they're
Mhm.
challenging, Ohio's in the States, they're challenging their emergency order. New Mexico is challenging their emergency order because they're looking at it because that's the beginning of it. That's the beginning of the panic button.
Mhm.
All these crazy unconstitutional measures started because they said, we have an emergency here.
Mhm.
And you can give them the benefit of the doubt. What I was saying earlier, you can say that your government acted in good faith. And I'm going to zoom right down to the particulars of this document here. There's a lot of things you take, that everything is here that you must take into consideration. But I'm going to show you here. Counting the continual declarations of emergency in Ontario. Like, I don't know if Canadians are way too trusting or we just don't care or what the deal is really, but we really should take a vested look at the rules that govern us. So under the Emergencies Act in Ontario, there are certain rules that you can keep people in a state of emergency. And so these are the rules under these sections. Section 7.071. It's a 14-day extension. So that was from March 17th to 30th. And then again, there was a second declaration, another period of 14 days, which so they're 14 days periods. There's 2 of them. And then it jumps to 28, 28, 28, and then another 28. But by the end of this, they had created the Reopening Ontario Act. So there's certain rules because, and I'm going to remind this to you or anybody that's listening, the very definition of an emergency means that it's temporary. That's why it's supposed to be 14 days, 14 days, 28 days. Oh, is the emergency done? No, not yet. Let's do it another 28 days, 28 days, still not done. That's the point, right?
Hmm.
We have forgotten, well, through deliberate design, I don't know, this agenda that people are talking about, that it's not an emergency. This is the full-time thing that they're doing to Canadians. It's not an emergency.
Hmm.
So yes.
I gotta ask, when do you think this is all going to end?
That's the question. When do you think it's going to end? When's it all going to end? Good question. Are you wondering like us how long this can go on for? So here's what people don't understand. The power shifted from the premier to the lieutenant governor and council. Who cares? This is all blah blah blah. It's so dry for people, and I understand that. But what it means is under when they created the Reopening Ontario Act. So back up here, there's rules. There's rules. People have to understand. There's criteria. We didn't meet it. There's rules for keeping people in a state of emergency. Here's the rules back here: 14 days, 14 days, 28, 28, 28 days. They created the Reopening Ontario Act, which I'm just saying down here. The power shifted from this EMCPA, Emergency Management Civil Protection Act, to the Reopening Ontario Act, which was only created, came into force in 2020 in July. That's because it keeps Ontarians in a state of emergency for 1 year at a time now, under Section 8.2, rather than every 28 days. And so people didn't realize the significance of this when this act was created. And literally, how can we possibly reopen Ontario if we are continually in a state of emergency for 1 year at a time?
So you're saying the significance of this legislation is specifically that it allows the state of emergency to remain in place for up to a year before being renewed, whereas under the previous legislation, it had to be renewed every 28 days?
Yeah, and up to a maximum, right? So don't forget, emergency is supposed to mean temporary, right? If there's a temporary, it's an emergency, it's temporary, it's not a permanent thing. So let's look at it after 48 days, oops, another 48 days, or 28, 28, 28, 14 days. Yes, there's certain rules that you have to follow. Otherwise, because then you're not supposed to be in an emergency, you're supposed to deal with it. And so under the Reopening Ontario Act, it just means that the powers shift. So the lieutenant governor has, oops, under the section 8.2, under this act, it just gives them the power to keep extending the emergency. Yes, for a year, for up to a year at a time.
So the emergency is never ending, no matter what the facts are, no matter what happened to the previous immediate dangers, no matter what happened to the previous original projections. It doesn't matter. We're in a state of emergency forever now. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yes, that's what it seems like. Yes, that's what I'm saying. Yes.
Wow. What's the number one thing you think people should take away from an analysis like this? What's the most important thing for people to understand, Paula?
Well, like anybody, Canadians are smart. We are a different breed than most countries. I mean, people come to us for help. We're peacekeepers, right? We go to
Yes.
other countries, we keep the peace, and we do all that, and we're a different breed, and we're very trusting. So I would say people need to maybe be a little more skeptical. I think people need to question things as opposed to being so trusting and willing to just go to the mat for anybody, because that's our nature. If somebody needs our help, we're there, right? That's what Canadians do. That's who we are. That's why we're loved throughout the world. But people need to stop and ask themselves, wait a second, how many deaths are there? We have to go back and look at the original reason for making an emergency. Now they've made it all about cases, cases, and there's great debate and questions about even the PCR tests, which we know aren't designed there to diagnose, this virus. So people you have to start and you have to go to the very beginning, because it's gone on for so long and it's convoluted, and it's like you need a clean slate. Start at the beginning and say, okay, how did this start? Let's just back it up and see. What did it take to say that everybody's in a state of emergency? Look for yourself, look and have a look at yourself. So I'm not alone in this for sure. Other lawyers are doing it and acting on it, which is what we need to do because we're never going to get our lives back if we don't get these emergency orders uh, officially terminated. Because, to remind everybody, social distancing, which of course is not scientifically proven, self-isolation, which is inhumane and cruel, crimes against humanity, all these things, business closures. Oh my God, Chuck, don't even get me started on business closures. First of all, they created a two-tier system in Canada for businesses. Where did they come up with that? There is no definition whatsoever for a non-essential business. That's a
Mm.
that's not true at all. Not that I could find. They can come out and show me an official government approved terminology for that. Great. They do have non-essential workers and essential workers, or actually they have essential workers, I should say, first responders and stuff like this. But they've created a false two-tier system for businesses, and everybody's bought into that package. And that second package, so the first ones are considered essential businesses, you know. Okay, good for you guys. Keep Canada running. The second set, non-essential. Oh, thank you for closing your doors and going bankrupt and keeping everybody alive and healthy. What a guilt trip to lay on people. That's non-constitutional.
I understand where you're coming from, and I thank you very much for your time, Paula. We
The
were
reason I get emphatic talking about it is because all these measures started because these declarations were declared. Therefore, hence, everybody has to use their common sense. Therefore, they'll all stop once this emergency has been declared over. That's the logic behind it. You can't. They started because of this. Therefore, they should all end once it's over. Correct?
absolutely, and you're saying that the only people here able to announce that the emergency is over are the people who no longer wish to follow stupid government restrictions.
Yeah. The people need to take their power back because we forget we've elected these people into power, and we've just we have a blind eye, turned a blind eye onto the legislation that's been written. We've not really been paying attention to it. And for any kind of legislation to be changed, there's got to be some kind of public outcry. There has to be some public outcry. Otherwise, we don't live in a free and democratic country. I mean, it's not looking like Canada. Hasn't looked like Canada for a long time now. And I've been saying to people in the beginning, it's the whole how do you boil a frog in a pot scenario. And you know that you
A
haven't
little
heard.
bit at a time,
Yeah,
slowly.
exactly. And then before you know it, you've bought that whole BS narrative that this is the new normal. There is nothing normal about not seeing your family. There is nothing normal about not hugging your children if they don't live in your home. There is nothing normal, Chuck, about not having more than 10 friggin' people allowed in a funeral to grieve the person that you've lost and you've loved. That's inhumane. There's nothing normal about a business shutting down and declaring bankruptcy for themselves, for the people that they employ. How is that normal? How's anybody going to accept that? And the very fact, if you watch the TV, and I don't watch television very much, but it should be illegal for our governments to be spending our taxpayer money to have commercials on television to try to just brainwash people or to reinforce that, hey, what you're doing is saving everybody. And I don't know. I don't think they have a right to ask people to give up so much to make others feel safe when we know, Chuck, that the majority of those deaths occurred in long-term care homes. That's the fault there. Those people are there because they are not well to begin with. Like that's the unfortunate situation. And you keep them isolated and you keep those windows shut in the wintertime when there's a virus and you keep that air being circulated, it's only a matter of time before people are going to get sick anyways. It's very inhumane the way people have been treated. There's nothing normal about that. And people should be absolutely furious that the government was shoving it down our throats from day one. There wasn't anything joyful about that.
I agree. And I'm going to wind up the interview. We will include links to the Stand Up for Canada website in the show
Yeah.
notes. We will include links to the documents you referenced in the show notes. And I want to thank you for your time. We've been speaking with Paula Tucci from Stand Up Canada.